Okay, I have 10 o'clock, so we are going to go ahead and get started. Thank you to everyone joining us. I know that this is an icy day across the state of Arkansas, so I don't know whether you're joining us from home or whether or not you made it into school or however, but I'm so glad that you're here. With that, I'm going to go ahead and put a little blurb to say that I'm at home, and sometimes I don't think I can control the noise at home as much as I can at work. So if you get any noise in the background, it could be me. I'm going to try to mute so as soon as we get them started. But today is on Unpacking Essential Standards or Unpacking Standards. And we just covered essential standards. And this topic, essential standards and unpacking standards, has been one of the most requested. And it's also been one of the most, I don't want to say frustrating, but it's one that causes a little bit more angst than, how do we really determine if it's essential and how do we know how to unpack it? So I'm very appreciative to Ms. Stobaugh and Ms. Dowks for joining us. Did I say it right?
You did.
For joining us today and just helping us with this. And I will be recording this, or Stephen, if you'll, yeah, he's got it recorded. So what we'll do is we'll upload this recording to the PLC website on the ADE webpage. And when you get on there, you'll see all of the web links and all the past webinars. So if you get to a point where you're working through the process of professional learning communities and you get stuck, go back and watch one of those other webinars. And what you will find at the end of each one of those webinars is the contact information for the Arkansas educators who are presenting. And you can reach out to them and I know that they are more than happy to help in any way, because it's one of those things that we've been experience something that's great and you don't want to hold on to it. We want to share it. So I appreciate y'all for joining us. So just a little bit of background. I go into this at the beginning. So those of you who've joined us on multiple webinars, I'm sorry if you're going to get it again, but it's one of those things that I want to keep us focused and know why we're here. So we are doing Unpacking the Standards, and I want to relate it first to, because we have the high reliability schools, and professional learning communities is such a huge component of the high reliability schools. And the way I look at high reliability framework, the school improvement framework, is like a file cabinet. And the bottom drawer is that foundation. It's the culture. You have to make sure that that culture is in place, meeting the basic needs of the students, the basic needs of the teachers, and that the parents and guardians feel that they have the basic needs of their children met in order to move forward. So you build that foundation, because if you start building from the top down, what happens in a file cabinet, but it falls over. So make sure you have that safe, supportive, and collaborative culture. And then in level 2, and again, that's going to go with that collaborative culture of PLC, which relates to one of the 3 big ideas, focus on learning in a collaborative culture and focus on results. So that's level 1. Level 2, effective teaching in every classroom. There we go with focusing on learning. We're not focusing on teaching, but we're focusing on learning. So teachers develop and maintain enhanced levels of skills. Students receive high quality instruction, but that focuses on the individual learning in the classroom. And then we move to level 3, which is a guaranteed and viable curriculum. And that's, what do we want our students to know? And we want to make sure, what do we want our students to know in this 2nd grade classroom is consistent with what we want them to learn in the other 2nd grade classroom, so that we can create a guaranteed and viable curriculum. So we're addressing those leading indicators. That's where we're identifying the essential standards. We are unpacking these standards. We're discussing proficiency descriptors. We are doing the common formative assessments, and really, so that's the biggest meat of this, is that collaborative time to make sure that we're offering the same rigor in every classroom. Level 4, the standards-based reference reporting. Again, there's your common formative assessments. How do we know that they know it? And that's looking at kid by kid, skill by skill. We know where they are. We can tell you this is their weakness, this is their strength, and we're going to build on those in order to get them to master the essential standards. And then level 5, the competency-based education. That deals with the question number 4 of the PLC. What do we do when they do know it? And that's moving students through curriculum as they master the curriculum. So there's not a lot of schools who are there where they're doing the competency-based education. Sometimes that causes a student to accelerate through grades, but it's they're showing their standards. I just lost my words. It's one of those things that you see a text or an email pop up on the corner of that screen, and it's just like chasing a squirrel, and that's what just happened. So I lost my words. Anyway, so we see that, you may move, and, there's mixed emotions about that, but it is something that meets the needs of our students. So where we started all of this and doing the webinars is with our statewide guiding coalition. Our statewide guiding coalition is started back when the pandemic started. Really, we started as a way to address unfinished learning, but it has grown since then, and we have now developed a different mission and vision to where our mission is to provide support and guidance for Arkansas educators in developing, leading, and sustaining a statewide professional learning community. Wouldn't it be awesome if the whole state operated as a professional learning community? Wouldn't it be awesome if a whole state operated with the guaranteed and viable curriculum? Our vision is to be a high-functioning collaborative team that plays an integral part in Arkansas, leading the nation in student-focused education. Our goals, and you'll see that through these webinars, we're meeting some of those goals, is implementing and spreading professional learning communities throughout the schools and districts, either webinars or conferences. There are a couple conferences coming up. I know some of there's a 1003 conference coming up June 15th and 16th, and then the ADE Summit will be happening the following week. I think it's June 21st, 22nd, 23rd, somewhere around in there that following week. And it will be offered both virtual and face-to-face. So more information will be coming out about that, but we will have presenters about professional learning communities at those conferences. Building collaborative teacher and administrator teams, which is how the statewide guiding coalition came about. And we have a statewide collaborative teacher team as well. Support in developing and growing professional learning communities through modeling and observations on site and visiting other schools. I don't know how many of you know that it is an option. If you want to go visit a school, if you go to the PLC website on the ADE webpage, you will see a Google form. So if there's something you want to see in particular, if you want to go see Morrilton Intermediate, which is where Sarah's the principal, and see one of their teams, a high functioning team operating in a PLC, maybe they are talking about essential standards. Maybe they're talking about a common formative assessment. Fill out that Google form and we'll try to connect the two so that you can do on-site or visit in other schools. It could be that we do it by Zoom. I know with the pandemic, we have to make some of those modifications. Partner with the model PLC school with other schools. So if there's, maybe kindergarten teams across 2 school districts want to partner and work on their standards, maybe we have singletons in another school. I really think that what we can do is think outside of the box. So if there's something else that you think about that you would love for your school to have access to, and we can help partner with that, please let me know. And I think one of the key components that we sometimes leave out, but it's one of the most important components, is to make sure that we take time to celebrate the statewide PLC successes, that you're celebrating at your school, you're celebrating within your district, and we're celebrating at the state, because so many good things have come out of this process. And when you know better, you do better. And that's what we're trying to do. So we're trying to do better. So again, I appreciate you joining us. I want to introduce and turn it over to Sarah. And Sarah and Ms. Dawkes are both with the Morrilton Intermediate School, and they're going to take it into unpacking the essential standards. So,
okay, thank you. I get very excited to talk about the work that we do. I know that this is only supposed to be an hour. If I get a little bit too long-winded, just cut me off, but there's our email if we leave some questions unanswered, which I'm sure we probably will, because this is a very big topic. This is something that our school visits every year, and we learn more about our standards every single year. So we're not going to be able.
Can I interrupt right there and say, if you have questions throughout the presentation too, you can put them in the Q&A and I'll try to answer those, or leave them at the end and have Sarah and Jesse answer those at the end too. So
yes. Okay. So as Miss Yardy said, I'm Sarah Snowball. I am the principal of Morrilton Intermediate School. We were part of cohort 1 with the Solution Tree PLC pilot. We worked really hard and learned so much and grew, and we were distinguished as a model PLC at the end of last year. That certainly does not mean that we have all the answers. It means that we're still growing for sure, but we did a lot of work. I also want to introduce Miss Jessie Dowks. She is a rock star teacher. She teaches 6th grade literacy. And so I invited her to be a part of this process. She joined us, Jessie, year 2, I think. Yes, year 2. And she is the classroom that I usually send all of our brand new teachers to learn, because she's a teacher of teachers and a teacher of students. So thank you, Jessie, for joining me on this. Okay, so what we're going to talk about today really focuses on question 1. What do we want students to know? Prioritizing and unpacking essential standards. I know if you joined the webinar, I believe it was last week, 2 weeks ago, they spent a lot of time talking about prioritizing standards. If you didn't join that webinar, I'm going to hit on that just a little bit before we get into the unpacking of the essential standards. So we know that there are a whole lot of standards and there's just not a lot of time. As soon as I started teaching, I was always taught, you can't get to everything. You can't get to everything. You're going to have to prioritize some of this. That to me was always really centered around the teacher and what the teacher could get to. And then I read, so early on, I always knew I can't get to all of this. So some of it just kind of fell by the wayside, which is what we're going to talk about not to do and how to prioritize those things. But it was always centered around what I could do as a teacher. And then I believe it was this summer, it might have been late spring, I came across an article by Dylan Willem, and he talked about why essential standards are so important. He uses the word that it is immoral to teach too full of a curriculum, because it leaves your pupils behind, your students behind. If we think that we can cram it all in there, it's not a matter of what we can do as a teacher, but it's what are we doing to our students if we don't prioritize these standards. So when I read this article by him, it really changed for me that we are hurting students if we don't prioritize our standards. We're putting too much in there for them. So I just wanted to share that. I found that on Twitter. Guys, I'm sure most of you are all on Twitter, but that is where I find my best PD resources, is through Twitter. There are some great things out there. So we know that essential standards are important, but I think it's worthy to note that he even uses the word that it's immoral if we are filling our curriculum too full, if we don't do this work to prioritize and unpack our standards. And then this year came. Anybody else feel like this? This is probably me with the mask on at least once or twice a day. Once this pandemic hit, and I think that most of you will agree, I didn't know if we were going to be in school for a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks. So we kind of had to come together and go. We had already done the work to prioritize our standards. We had to spend time this past summer prioritizing our essential standards, because none of us knew how long we were going to be in school. Missy talked about celebrating earlier. I think it's worth celebrating that we've made it past the 100th day mark, and we're still here. At least we are. So once COVID hit, I think Josie would agree, we met and had to become very crystal clear on what was the most important thing for us to teach. And did we have it in a good sequence? Because we know the reality is the student comes on campus, we may lose them for 2 weeks if they're quarantined, they may lose us. So we had to really prioritize our essential standards. So if you don't feel like this, please shoot me an email and tell me what your secret is. So we talk a lot about essential standards. Those are just the skills to identify the knowledge, dispositions that all students must acquire as a result of that course or that grade level. We always say these are our hills to die on. And when we're having discussions around essential standards, we will ask that question, is this your hill to die on, and why? or don't pass, you can't pass go, whatever it must be. But these are the standards that you're going to lose sleep at night if you don't get these to your students. That's how we think about our essential standards. One of the questions that we've had some schools come in and visit or reach out to us. And one of the things that we get is, the question that I get is that all that you teach? It's not all that you teach. And I think sometimes for a brand new teacher, if you see that you've scaled down your essential standards to 8 or 10, you suddenly think, is this all I'm doing this year? It's not all you're doing, but that's just the big standard. And we're going to talk a little bit before we get into how to unpack them, a little bit about how you prioritize and the purpose of the supporting standards. Now, Jesse, at any point, if you need to jump in on some of this, but I just want to note that, because I think sometimes we make the mistake and think that what we're saying is, here are 8 standards, that's all you're going to do, don't worry about anything else. The other standards have a purpose. They just may not be your hill to die on. So this is how I like to explain that. And I'm going to kind of rush through this, because if you joined the other webinar, she probably covered some of this. So when I think about standards, I have to think about a fence. And the most important part of that fence would be the post. Your fence, doesn't matter how many pickets you have in between, that fence is not going to stand if you don't have those posts. So you have the post that you have to start with. Then you will add those supporting standards in between. And then the learning targets really serve as those small pieces in between. Now, if I were to walk up to that fence and kick down one of those pickets, one of those learning targets, it's okay, that fence is still going to stand. But if I knock down that post, the fence is collapsing. That's how important those essential standards are. They have to really ground your work. So this is just one way that makes sense for our teams of how we explain that. And I just wanted to be able to share that. Okay, so I mentioned that you don't lose the other standards, they just may become supporting standards. And again, I'm flying through this because we really want to get to the meat of how do you unpack those standards. So for our school, for our 4th grade team, this is one of their essential standards. Determine the main idea. This is big for us. Summarizing is really, really big for us. This is their hill to die on. They are going to circle back to this standard. They're going to spiral this standard. But then we've identified these other 2 standards support that one. So there may not be a big assessment on RI 4.1 and RL 4.1, but they're going to tie right back into that. We're going to observe those standards because they're supporting, and we're going to make sure that we really assess and tackle the 4.2. So that's what we mean when we say the essentials are not all that you teach, but that's where you're going to put your energy into your assessment and your intervention. Jesse, anything you want to jump in on that? Or are you good?
I think we're good.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So once you have determined your essential standards, and really we spend time unpacking all of them, but I wanted to go through and talk about how we determine the essential standards. Let's look at some of the documents that we use for unpacking. Now for our school, when we say unpack, we're going to take that big standard and we're going to break it apart piece by piece. We're going to identify the learning targets that are in there. We're going to identify what the supporting standards are. We're going to identify proficiency levels. What do we expect it to look like when a student masters that standard? So I'm going to pull this document up and we're going to, Jesse, this is yours. So I'm going to go ahead and let you start talking about how we do this. Now, before she talks about it, all of our teams, they do this differently as far as, and Jesse, I think you're going to talk about this. They do this differently as far as where it comes for them in the process. Some of our teams take their essential standards and their supporting standards and they unpack everything at the very beginning of the year, all of it. They go through the whole process. Some of our teams, it makes more sense for them after they've identified essential and they're supporting They unpack as they build the units. This is me. It does not matter to me. Whichever process makes the most sense for our teams is what they do. I'm loose on that. I'm tight on you've got to unpack it. You've got to go through all of the steps that it takes. But when it happens in your planning, it's totally up to our teams. All right, Jesse, you want to take it away on this one?
Yes, and as being on the 6th grade literacy team, we are the type of team that like to do it at the very forefront of it. So we're understanding exactly what our learning targets are as we are moving through our unit. But for example, with the beginning of Unpacking a Standard, you have just your standard, your full out what you get from like our Arkansas State Standard. So we chose RL 6.3 just to walk through the process. So our full standard would be to describe how a story or drama's plot unfolds in a series of events, as well as how the characters respond or change as the plot moves forward towards a resolution. So that is our full standard. Okay, so if you showed a student that full standard, that is a whole lot. Like you don't know really where to start. It's like, okay, so what does this mean? So the two main things that we do is we look at the verbs and we look at the nouns. So our nouns you will see are underlined and our verbs are highlighted. So our nouns are really going to be those skills-based vocabulary that we know that our students are going to have to understand to be successful. Okay, so Sarah, if you'll scroll down just a little bit. So then after we have identified like what are those skills-based nouns and what are those verbs, we then have our skills and our concepts. So we know, we saw that our verbs were describe, respond, change, and move. And then our skills-based nouns were really that we picked out were story, drama, plot, resolution, and characters. So specifically from that standard, what are the students having to describe? Well, they're having to describe how the plot is unfolding in a story or drama. And that's the same with what are they responding to? Well, they're having to also explain to us, well, how is the character responding as the character changes throughout the story as that plot is also unfolding. So once we have really picked out those verbs and we've picked out those nouns and we've broken that down, we then can get like our student friendly I can statements in our learning targets. For us as a 6th grade literacy team, we like to put the highest depth of knowledge level type I cans first, because that's obviously our end goal. We want our student to get to the deepest understanding of the standard. So then we have then developed down into, I can analyze how a character responds or changes as the plot moves forward, which is the highest DOK level. If you scroll down a little bit more, we'll see that one of our other big learning targets is that I can describe how a plot unfolds in a series of events, and then I can identify the elements of a story or plot. So you'll notice in the standard, it doesn't mention like those 5 elements of plot, the exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, and resolution, but a student has to understand that. But one thing that's also important to understand is no matter how many learning targets you have, you don't necessarily formally assess every single one. So like, yes, we have to understand with teaching this standard, the students have to understand what an exposition is. But like on a formal CSA, they aren't just telling us, well, the exposition is the beginning of a story where their characters and setting are revealed to the reader. Okay, well, yes, they have to know that, but we've got to take it even further where they're identifying, well, what is the exposition in that story? So I think here in just a few minutes, Sarah, we've also linked one of the summatives so that we can see like, okay, what is the end goal? Like what would mastery look like with this learning target? And then it just depends. Every single standard could have so many different learning targets. And then I kind of like to think of learning targets as like little checklists. Okay, the students have to be able to master these little learning targets to be able to master the overall standard. And I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
I'm going to show one more example. Thank you. Let me go. So this is another example, and I put both of these, I put literacy examples in there because that's Jesse teaches literacy, and that's kind of where I built this off of, but the process is the same for math.
For every single subject area.
And for all of our subjects, we follow the exact same process. You start with a big standard, you look at your verbs, your nouns, and then you break it apart. Again, I I am not a template person. So all of our teams have a different template for how they put this together. I'm loose there. Template isn't really going to change a lot. It's the process and how well you know the process that will really improve us as learners and teachers. So this is the 5th grade, and they have a very similar setup. They also, they have this started at the beginning of the year, and then they add to it. One of the things that I wanted to show about theirs, we're going to look at this one right here because summarizing and theme is really big for 5th grade for us. So they have their standard in the exact same process that Jesse just walked us through. They have underlined their verbs, and then they've highlighted their nouns. I'm just going to tell on myself, when I taught, it is so important, and I know that seems so simple, underline and highlight, but when I taught, and I taught high school English, you would catch me saying, I'm teaching summary. Well, what about summary? What is it that I'm needing them to do? And I would oftentimes look over the verbs completely. How in the world did I know what DOK level I was going to get my students to if I had not even really spent much time looking at the verbs? You've got to have those conversations around the verbs. You've got to. Otherwise, I may just have stopped with my students being able to tell me what a summary was and thought I was a fabulous teacher. But if I didn't ever look at what the verbs were, I didn't know how far to take my students. And that's a huge part of unpacking your standards. So just like she described, our 5th grade team follows the same process. They have underlined, they have highlighted their verbs, and then this 3rd column, these are their I can statements. This particular standard has a lot of I can statements. And let me reiterate, as Jesse said, you are not creating an assessment on every single one of those I can statements. You are observing those. And I'm going to give an example of that in just a little bit. Then their 4th column, and Jesse had this as well in their document, those are ideas for what they're going to use to teach those standards. So how will I know if they've got this? These are just some things that they're going to pull from. Now, if you were to attend their collaborative team meetings, they're fleshing all of that out. They're talking about what organizers they're using. They're not just, okay, here's the list, I'm going to do exit slips. They're sitting together and talking about what's going to be on the exit slip. What am I going to use?
And
here's another.
Sorry, Sarah, we all give the same exit slip in the same exact format.
Yes.
To make sure that it's common across all teachers.
This column that has the questions, I think as educators, sometimes we may try to wing this part, and you can't really wing it. We spend time after we have unpacked the standards before we ever start teaching, and we start listing questions. This is not an exhaustive list of questions that they're going to ask, but we start formulating what are the questions that we are going to ask to get us to know if these kiddos know this standard. So before we start teaching, part of the unpacking process is also putting our questions down there. And again, this is just a start. When they get into their collaborative team, they will really flesh out the list of questions that come up. And then just like Jesse's team does, they also determine the DOK levels. I'm happy to share any of those documents with you, totally fine, but I think it's super important that your teams go through the process themselves. Don't rely on our work, because if you rely on our work, your teams will have no ownership of the process. And I'll talk about that a little bit more and have Jesse weigh in on some of that.
Oh, go ahead, Sarah.
I'm sorry. With you saying that comment right there, that's going to go right into a question that someone just asked that I think it would be a good time to address that.
Okay.
That learning by doing piece of it.
Yes.
And let me make sure that I say the question right, because it is a great question that districts struggle with? Is there a risk that different districts will choose different essential standards? I don't know, my document's not full size. Or should the essential standards be based upon patterns of achievement and weakness in student achievement for each school? So, I mean, this kind of covers essential standards and learning targets. Can you talk about how the ownership in determining this essential standards and learning targets?
Sure. So the process that we follow, because we do get that question, we will sometimes have people say, just share your document and we're going to use your essential standards. While you may arrive at the exact same list, I think it's very important that you go through your process. And this is how we determine, and this came from our Bible, Learning by Doing. And we follow a process, and it's, I'm sure you've probably heard this before, but when we look at the standards, we ask, is it real or not? Real is readiness for the next grade. So we will look at, let's take Jesse, for example, 6th grade. They'll look at the 7th grade standards and see what's in the 6th grade standards and then determine, well, we've got to teach this so they will be successful for 7th grade. And so that's the first thing that we do. Will it get them ready for the next grade? Endurance beyond the grades. There's not a profession out there that students are not going to have to be able to communicate. Writing is huge. So does it have endurance beyond our grade? Is this just for 4th grade math standard, or will this carry them on to 5th grade? Or if you are high school all the way through, does it have that endurance? The next one is that we look at is it assessed? We always review our state assessments. We look at that. We look at the performance level descriptors, what matches up in our grade, what standard really matches with performance level descriptors as far as the OK levels, and what are they assessed on. That is the next test that we put our standards through. And then the last one is leverage. Will it cross other curriculum? Is there, especially when we're looking at reading informational text, that's huge. What skills do we need to teach that will help them be a successful student in science, in social sciences, in business classes, all of those things. So you can find that in Learning by Doing, but that is the process that we follow, is just the real. And you know, school districts have their curriculum, especially when you get into high school and when things are offered, it may be set up a little bit differently. So I don't think that you can just take another school's work and apply it to your school. I think that you still have to go through the process. And again, we may all arrive at the exact same standards, but if all I did was hand you our essential standards with the teachers not taking the time to go through that process, there is no ownership of what they are teaching, in my opinion.
And I want to say too, just because we're asked frequently at the state level, will the state ever determine essential standards and let the districts know? Mm-hmm. And my answer to that question is, I hope not. Because the process, and you said it perfectly, you know, the template was not what you're going to fall on. It's the process that you want them to have. And that process of determining those essential standards and unpacking the standard is where the conversation is what's so important.
And Missy, I would say that, just to give a story on that, I would say that especially our 5th grade literacy team would say the same thing. We had a teacher that was and I'm off a little bit on this, but I feel very passionate about this, about that you've got to go through the process. And it is quoted, Rick DeFore quoted it and said, it's got to be your work in your schools. But our 5th grade team, we lost our team lead, and she left the most beautiful binder for our teachers ready to go. And they thought, oh, well, I'll open that up and get started. They struggled in the classroom. They also thought that they could rely on, and they wouldn't mind me, they tell this story themselves. They also thought that they could rely on that throughout the year. Well, we got back assessment data And they changed a standard based on that data that had just come out, based on what they saw that the students were testing on. So something that they felt was a supporting standard suddenly got bumped up to an essential based on looking at the data and running everything through that real process that I just described. So even if the state were to come out and say, these are the standards, that's going to change as things around us change. So it's got to be our process.
And we added an essential standard last year, 6th grade did, that was not normally an essential standard, but after we got back ACT Aspire results from the year prior, we're like, oh, this standard is very heavily tested on ACT Aspire, and it's not even one of our essentials. So we have quickly figured out that we're back at square one with that essential standard. And we just yesterday during PLC, we're taking it all the way back to unpacking that standard. So just because like you don't have one essential standard there now doesn't mean it can't be added or adjusted.
Absolutely. So I'm glad that, like I said, I'm glad that you brought that up, because sometimes that becomes my soapbox. I think sometimes as leaders, we think that we are helping by handing, you know, here's our, and I hope I'm not stepping on toes by saying this, but here is our district team, and we're going to spend all summer deciding what's important for your classroom. And then the teams don't have the ownership in the process. And we go through this process of revisiting these standards every single year. And maybe we don't, you know, it gets easier if it stays an essential standard or a supporting standard and you've already unpacked it, the process gets easier, but we still spend time going back through those standards every year and making sure that we're still on track for the OK levels. Do we truly understand what an assessment will look like for this standard? So it's got to be in the hands of the teachers to unpack these standards. Okay, so we talked a little bit about this, about how to unpack, and then I talked some about, we looked at the I can statements, and do you have to assess on all of those? Please do not make the mistake that we did in thinking that you have to assess every little part of the I can statements, because we did that year 2. Teachers were running they were exhausted, thinking that they had to have an exit slip or a formal assessment on every single part of that standard. So we talk a lot about, is this something I can observe, or is this something that I need to assess? So I've given this example before about learning to ride a bike. And I actually, I heard someone else use this example, and it resonated with me because I have 2 little girls that are 18 months apart. So a lot of what they learned, they kind of learned together. One of those things being riding a bike. My older daughter, Eliza, was ready to learn to ride, and younger sister Scout wanted to learn with Eliza. So my husband, who is in charge of teaching children to ride a bike, not me, took them out one summer, taught both of them how to ride a bike. Eliza, so you know the steps of riding a bike. You got to teach kids where the brakes are, where to put their hands, how to turn, all of those things. Eliza picked up riding a bike really quickly. Now, keep in mind, both of these are our students. We have the same goal. We're going to ride a bike. Eliza learned very quickly. She was good. We could observe her. She's figured it out. She's done. We assess her by making sure she's got her helmet on. She's pedaling. She knows where the brakes are. She's good. Scout, on the other hand, she was a little bit slower. She's 18 months younger than Eliza. It's going to take her a little bit longer. We did not stop Eliza and say, you've got to stop, because we've got to assess Scout first and make sure she's got this, and holding Eliza back. We didn't stop and say, okay, today's assessment day. Do you know where your brakes are on the bike? We just observed it. The end goal was riding the bike. That's the big standard. We just observed everything in between. So I use that analogy to kind of think about your I can statements. If you're asking your students to be able to define theme and you see that they've all got it, move on to the next piece. Don't slow down and say, tomorrow's assessment day on this, so let's stop what we're doing, because you're going to really get bogged down in all the little pieces, and you're never going to be able to move to the big picture, the big standard. So think about when you break apart and you unpack and you've identified your I can statements. Those can be observed. You can also go back and move around within those I can statements based on where your students are. We have a daily 45-minute intervention block. If we've got a kid that we are observing that they don't quite have all the I can statements of that unpacked standard, we may pull them back during the intervention block. It may just be walking over and having a quick conversation, which Jesse's wonderful at this. Kids are working. She's going to pull this kid over. Okay, I've observed now that you have that I can statement, so we're ready to move along. So when you unpack these standards and you see that long list of I can statements that we showed you, there does not have to be an assessment for every bit of that. You're going to have those CSAs and the CSAs along the way that you've got to use that data to see where you are in that standard, but it doesn't have to have all of those I cans tied into it. Okay, another piece that's very helpful, and I talked about this earlier, when you are unpacking your standards, I will say that I feel I have spent a lot of my career in high school, and a lot of what I hear in high school is it's really, really hard to do vertical alignment because a lot of the classes you feel are standalone classes, especially math. They may not build quite like we see in a K-6 setting. So this is, I do have experience for that vertical piece in high school, but I am going to give this example since now I'm working in elementary world. But one of the things that we do when it comes to deciding and unpacking your essential standards is looking at the standard above and below where we are. So if we have a question when we look at, if it says examine, or let's look at the one actually, why not? The one that's right in front of us. So this standard builds. So describe in depth a character setting, and you can read. And then the next year you're going to compare and contrast. We know when we're unpacking that standard for 4th grade, we only have to take them to describe. But what if your kid gets to describe a lot faster than another kid? You've got to look at that vertical piece to know where to take that kid. Okay, now you can describe the character. Now I want you to compare and contrast, because I know that that's where 5th grade is going to take you to, because I have looked at that vertical piece. This right here is a very beneficial part. When you are first getting started, we didn't do this quite at the beginning. It was a nice to know for us until we really felt good about our standards and we revisited them. That's when we went to the vertical piece. Jessie, would you agree with that?
Yeah, and we do this, like we have a document too. Of course, I feel like our school is the most document, and it may be the 6th grade team. We've got a document literally for everything. Sarah makes fun of us on the 6th grade team because literally everything there is a document for it. But we have done the vertical alignment, and since I'm in 6th grade, for 5th grade and 7th grade for every single essential standard.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, we've had that open communication with 7th grade of like, what are your essentials? And the same with 5th grade being in our building, it is, okay, what are your essentials? So that there's that extension piece, like Sarah was saying, so you don't hold those students that have already mastered it quicker than others back. You're extending them and pushing them forward to what they will be doing in 7th grade.
And I will tell you, don't be overwhelmed by that and think, okay, I have to unpack all these standards. I have to choose them, unpack them, and now you want me to be able to know exactly what's happening above and below and all of that. We did not start there. We started with just our unpacking, and then we went to the vertical piece. That is not what happened at the very beginning. You will overwhelm your teams, and you will get overwhelmed if you are trying to do all of this at one time. Start first with your grade level, and then start to look at that vertical piece. Some of you may be rock stars and you can jump in all at once. We could not. We spent a year unpacking, making sure that we really were clear on what we were doing, and then we added in that vertical piece.
And unpacking really becomes kind of like second nature once you get started.
Right.
Like it's kind of, you automatically look at it and it's like, oh, those verbs and nouns jump out at you. Okay, now we can know what the concept is to start making our learning targets.
And to speak to our high school friends that are on here, some of the work that we did around this when you unpacked the standards, and then when we were ready to look at the vertical piece, we spent a lot of times just looking at the verbs, because the content can be different, but you can align those verbs. You can look and say, let's just say for a social science class, I'm teaching American history, and then they're going to go into world history. You can look at those and say, in their writing, how far do I need to take them this year? And where is the next subject going to pick them up? Yes, the content is completely different, but you can align the skill part of it. How far, what do you expect a 10th grader, what should their writing in a social sciences class look like? When they move to 11th grade, what should their writing look like? That's a really good place to start when you're looking at vertical alignment. Science, what kind of science student are you trying to create? Yes, biology and chemistry are different, but what's the skill set? So you could spend some time with your teams, even though you're teaching two completely different subjects. Look at your verbs. What do you expect a 10th grade science student to be able to do? What are you going to add to that in 11th grade? So I know that high school is a different animal when it comes to some of this, and that's usually the question that I get. Yes, but these are different subjects. Start with looking at your verbs if you're wanting to do some of the vertical alignment. Okay, so we've unpacked our standards, and we have just a little bit more time. The biggest part of how in the world you've done all this work unpacking them, how do you know how successful you were in teaching this? You've got to look at your summative, or this is a summative. You have to look at your assessment. We don't really have a lot that just stays a summative assessment, because the summative assessment feels very final, and we always intervene. So don't get caught up on the word summative. It's just assessment. So Jesse, I'm going to open this for you if you want to walk them through some of this.
Yes, I'll be more than happy to. So this is just an example, and I did it with the same one of the standard that we unpacked, or that I showed you for 6.3, where we're describing how the plot unfolds in a series of events and how the character changes as the plot unfolds. So we have, at the beginning of every assessment, you have your student-friendly learning targets. So the students, because we go over those daily in class, so the students understand, oh, what we've been working on all along is, are they not popping up at the top? Oh, well, it's okay.
No, that's okay.
Weird. Okay, they're normally up at the top. And so just so that the kids understand, like, oh, this is what we've been working on, like I can do this. So on our CFAs, we do have students, we don't normally give them multiple choice. We do have them trying to identify the 5 elements of plot by themselves. But since it is, and they're taking it to that deeper the DOK, we went ahead and did multiple choice first. So it's just, can they identify those 5 elements of plot in a story? That is the first one. And if you scroll down to part B, is really where you get to those higher DOK levels. The students are literally just given a question and they have to write. So it's beginning with the exposition and then going through those elements of plot, describe how the plot unfolds in a series of events. So that's essentially them being able to identify those 5 elements of plot and put them into words. Okay, so then it ends up being about like a paragraph form. And then that's the same with describe how the mother crow responded throughout the beginning, middle, and end of the story. And that's where we're really getting into those character traits. So the students are making inferences based off those characters' actions and then describing how they change throughout. And then, of course, we have our grading rubric at the end. And I think Sarah touched on this a little bit, just when, how do you know your students are proficient in mastering the standard? So then, of course, we just have our answer keys in our rubrics that we all agree on how we are grading to show mastery for all of it. And then we have our, after the full assessment, we have our scoring of how it would be exceeding, ready, close, or in need of support that aligns with ACT Aspire.
It's not popping up on here, and I wish it was, but that's okay. One of the things that we have done is we're going to tear these standards apart and we write them in student-friendly terms, but we want to you don't ever want the students to not know what they're getting into. So like she said, and there's usually a cover sheet, and I'm so sorry.
That
it's not
whole thing
on
is
here.
not attached for some reason. It's where the
That's
learning
okay.
targets are in that.
Yes. So all of our assessments, 4, 5, 6, the very first page, it has all of those learning targets for those students. We're not going to trick them. They know what it is that we've been working on. This is what we're going to assess you on. And then we will do a reflective sheet where the students will then mark, this is how I think I did on this I can statement. This is how I think I did on this I can statement. So they are marking up their own rubric before the teacher ever gets their hands on it. We want it to be as visible learning,
As possible.
that didn't make sense, as possible.
Yeah.
So that is something that we added. Again, not year one. We got to that probably more last year, but that has made a huge difference. If I'm going to spend all this time unpacking these standards, we want these students to have ownership of what it is that they're doing.
And I will be more than happy to, if you shoot me an email and want to see that document, I will shoot you an email with it back. It's super simple to make, and the kids really enjoy doing it.
Mm-hmm. And this kind of goes back to what, Missy, you were just saying, and I said that it's quoted in the book. The learn what question is simply too vital to a PLC process to be left to either an individual teacher or those outside of the school. The constant collective inquiry into this question is a professional responsibility of every faculty member in a PLC. I know I just read that to you and you could read it yourself, but I wanted to make sure we heard every word of that because I think that answers what you were just asking about. And that has changed for me. I was a leader that said, let's put this work in central office and make it easier on the teachers and then hand it to them.
Okay, I'm going to freeze you there, right there. One, before we move on, someone's computer, I think they said, looks like it's about to die. So I don't know if we're looking at someone's that might need to be plugged up. Will you expand on that just a little bit, Sarah, where you are? Because that's a question that's in the chat box is how do you see teacher ownership in the PLC process impacted by the school and district expectations when your district is giving you a program that you have to follow with fidelity?
Oh man, that's kind of hard for me because that's not been my experience. We are very much a grassroots. We developed our own curriculum, but I think that it is important. And again, I don't want to step on toes and get into someone saying, Sarah Stovall says that this is not what we're supposed to be doing in our district, because that is your district's decision. But we have invested in, I'm trying to see, I don't know if it's my computer or not, so I'm going to talk fast if it is, because my charger is not near me if mine's about to stop. We have invested in some resources. But before we invest in those resources, we go through the process and we know our standards, and it's got to fit what we're doing or we're not buying into it. And we follow our standards and our curriculum that we've developed with fidelity. But we are not a district that purchased a curriculum and handed it to our teachers for them to use. We started with the standards first. We went through that process and then said, this is where we have holes that we need some help. We need some resources here. So that's how we developed our curriculum. And I think that that's the way you have to do it. It can't be, here's your curriculum and now make it fit what you're trying to do.
Yes, so that is a question that I get a lot from PLC project schools who are working within a larger district is, how do we do this when this is the program that's given to us and we need to follow this program? And Mike Mattis addresses this every time when he does his presentation, is he started that way where his district was telling him something and he tried to do it as much as he could, but knowing that there's a PLC process. So when he started showing results to the district started saying, let's talk about that. Let's look at that. So it's one of those things that when you bring the evidence back to the table of how it's working, it's a good conversation to have with your district. But anytime that you're doing the PLC process, I think it's very important to invite your district in to see the conversations. When you're a part of those conversations and you see what's going on and the depth of those conversations, it's just hard to deny. So
I agree.
Invite the district in to watch that.
I share our calendar with our superintendent, and he knows when our collaborative team meetings are happening, and he pops in and pops out of them quite often, and saw the results. So I would suggest inviting someone to come around and see what it is that you're working on, like you just said, and let them see that process. It's too important to not have the conversation with those that are making the decision. I don't think that I could never throw up my hands and say, goodness, I'd really like to do this PLC process, but they've handed this to me and there's nothing I can do about it. Go through the process and don't just throw the curriculum out. There could be really good pieces in there once you get into the process, but you've got to start with those standards. You've got to go through those 4 questions and then make your curriculum around that. That's where we've seen the success. And like I said, we don't just throw our hands up. I had a meeting yesterday with our associate superintendent because we're seeing holes. We're seeing where we need some support. And so we had conversations around what resources do we need to now go purchase to make those, to fill in where we're seeing some of those gaps. But they will work for us. The resources will work for us. We're not going to work around those resources, if that makes sense, because we're the experts. We know the students that are sitting in front of us. The curriculum doesn't know the students that are sitting in front of us.
I'd also like for both of you to kind of talk a little bit on newer teachers. When you have a new teacher that you've hired, how do you engage them in this process? When they're still not for sure of the standards, what is your process with including new teachers?
Jessie, I'll speak real quickly on that and then you can pop in. Jessie has 2 brand new team members on her team this year. And when we said that we revisit these standards every year, that's why you have to. We know how to go through the process, but like I gave the example of, I had a new 5th grade team and the outgoing teacher handed them the curriculum, or the standards unwrapped. They were not successful. They had to go through that process. And I think Jessie would agree with that.
So you have to start with unpacking the standard. And I can also speak, last year was my first year of ever teaching literacy. I had taught social studies before. So of course it is similar. You don't realize it's similar until you're there. But so it really, really helps. Again, you have to start by unpacking the standard. And that's like, no matter, we used the same essential standards last year, but we knew that we had 2 new team members. So 2 of us, we went back and we worked through unpacking those standards with them. And just, again, leaning on the people that have taught it for many, many years helps.
As a leader on my end, the first thing that I do when I hire a new teacher before first day of school is they get this book. And I point them in the direction that where I think that they need to start reading, and we walk them through that process. We don't just say, here you go, there's your classroom, go figure it out. Myself, as well as our instructional facilitator, we usually spend a day, 2 days with all of the new staff, kind of getting them up to speed, but also letting them know that you are just as important as the veteran teacher on the team. And then we start the process back over. Every year, we've got to start the essential standards and unpacking those, start that back over for those new teachers.
How often
and it helps us because we can understand the standard so much better every single year.
Right.
How often each week does your collaboration occur?
We have a schedule set up that all of our, well, to answer your question, they have a set 2-hour block. We work some magic in our master schedule. Every team has a set 2-hour block that they meet. They
One
meet
day
in
a
our
week.
once a week.
Yeah.
That's their set time. We have, and they have to meet, now this is me, they have to meet in room 507. The reason is, as a leader, my schedule gets crazy. I know that I can go to 507 and catch a team meeting. I don't, without looking at my schedule. 507 is really close to my office. So I can walk down and catch a team meeting. I may not know the schedule perfectly, but I know I'm about to walk into a meeting. They all have common planning time for an hour and a half every day at the same time. Most of our teams now, they meet informally every single day to discuss something, but there is that's a tight once a week 2-hour block of time that they are meeting, protected time, going through the 4 questions.
Awesome. All right, what if you have 5 buildings teaching the same grade level? If they're all creating their own essentials, how do you guarantee a consistent education across the district? And I'm just working with another large district. I can tell you how they did it. And one of the things that Mike Mattis says that they did within their district is they brought the teams together at the district office and worked together on creating those essential standards, and constantly brought the data back to the table with those teams together at the central office, so that they were still creating their essential standards, but they were doing it as a district at the same table. And if y'all want to add anything to that.
Well, our district, we have 1 building. So I have worked in a larger district where but I didn't work at the elementary level in that district, but there were 6 other schools. And I know that was one of their frustrations, but I can give you this experience. It's a little bit different, but our guiding coalition. So it's kind of the same concept. We come together as the guiding coalition, and there is 1 representative from every team. So essentially that could be 1 of every school. We come together and we talk about whatever it is that may be coming up, and it may be around
She may have just cut out.
She did. She may
have just cut out.
She may have been the computer that was dying. Okay. I think she was going to say that instead of them bringing the whole team to the table, what they did is they used their guiding coalition and brought leaders of that team
to that's what she's talking about.
Yeah, to represent that grade level. So instead of sending, you've got 6 second grade teachers at this school and 4 second grade teachers. So instead of bringing 35, 40 people together, they created their essential standards together with those 6, and 1 representative went to the district office and still worked together to create this essential standards. And there still will be a little bit of a difference, just because as you're pulling that data, and that's just an understanding that you have those conversations with your district office as you're pulling that data. And let's just say I had, occasionally we might have a weak teacher in the previous grade level. So there's something that the students didn't get that I'm going to have to, because of the data from ACT Aspire, I'm going to have to make sure that I make that an essential, because they can't continue moving forward without that. So it may be just a hair different, not enough that it's going to make a big difference, but just a hair difference in essentials from campus to campus. But having the conversations are powerful. Mm-hmm. Anything you want to add to that?
I came from a PLC school, but it was a much larger district, and it was kind of like you had mentioned already. We had a department chair for the whole district, and then every single individual school had like a representative. So they came together and all decided on the essential standards together to then take back. So it was a common district essential standards.
Good. And that can work. I mean, that's not it's just the fidelity part is hard when you have someone coming in and saying, hey, this is what you have to do.
Correct.
So just helping that district office understand. All right. And I think there are several links in here. So Stephen, if we'll make sure that we keep those up, just so that I'm trying to send them the PowerPoint. The recording will be uploaded to the PLC page on the ADE website. So we will get that. It usually takes me, it takes Stephen really that day. He gets it back to me really quick. It's myself and getting it to the web page people to get it uploaded. So give me about a week before that appears on the website. And if you email me sooner, I might can drop you what Stephen sends me. But other than that, give me a week to get that up. Are there any other questions? So I'm going to ask you Jesse, if you'll just give me a peek into, because you covered something through your presentation that I would love for them to hear a little bit more.
Okay.
And is your proficiency level.
Mm-hmm.
When you are going through your verbs and you're talking about proficiency, can you kind of, I don't know, mimic a conversation of what happens? What does that look like within your collaborative team?
I think it still just is trying to get them back to that highest DOK level. So for example, let's look at character change, for example. So whenever we're talking about how the character is changing or responding throughout the story. So whenever we're talking about character traits, is really they're making those inferences based on their actions and identifying that character trait. So they can identify the character trait, but okay, if they're able to back their answer with evidence from the text that supports that character trait, they're going to have that higher level of mastery and higher level of proficiency because they're able to identify that evidence piece with it. So when we're looking at like full mastery of that, we're looking, okay, can they identify how the character is at the beginning with evidence? Can they identify how the character is at the end with evidence? Can they determine how they are changing and what the conflict is that has happened to make that event, that changing event, change them? Or if they're not changing, can they give that evidence piece to support it? So some students may be able to tell you how they are, but then they can't give you that evidence piece with it. So then that's going to help us determine that level of mastery. Okay, I can't hear. Oh, you're muted.
Yeah, I'm sorry. That is a conversation when we first started with the PLC process. Matter of fact, it happened with the 5th grade ELA team, because the craft of the professional, they go back and teach it. However, their craft. So let's say I like to do it with novel studies, and let's say I like to use the basal, but I know the rigor that I've got to get to. So the first time we started implementing and really looking at the data of those CFAs, when they would bring them back, and you had one teacher going, oh, I didn't realize I needed to get to this rigor. I've got to go back. So that's the reason why it's important to create those CFAs together and understand the rigor and that proficiency. What DOK level are we trying to get to? And then you change the teaching, because the teacher's the professional and they've got a craft. That's the new art and science of teaching.
Correct. And it will help us as a PLC team as well. We also always sit down and grade one together. So when we are grading those CFAs, it's like, okay, so making sure that we are getting to that DOK level that we need to, we have like a time where we can sit down and we grade one together. It's like, okay, do we all understand what we are looking for and an agreement of what we are looking for, which has really helped us.
Yeah. Back to the conversation again.
Mm-hmm.
Any tips for schools with singletons? Singletons is a different, it's going to be a vertical. You're going to have to work on some of that vertical. Where do we expect, especially when you get to your high school, some of those standards are the same. It's just the complexity of them is just a little bit different. But I will say that we are trying to kick up a statewide collaborative teacher team across the state, to where we have a kindergarten team that if you're a singleton kindergarten teacher, you can join that statewide team and have those conversations with other teachers across the state. The same with high school. Every grade level, every content area, we're trying to kick that up so that we can help the singletons, because that is a struggle. But the vertical alignment, the vertical conversations, understanding the difference in standards and still bringing that data back to the table with a math group, even though I'm the only Algebra 1 teacher. Or if you have a CTE teacher who's teaching business classes, they can use the rubrics that the ELA teacher is using. And so they can still have those conversations of planning and using that rigor. So, but we are trying to kick up some collaborative teacher teams. So look for a commissioner's memo on that soon. Why are we using the ACT Aspire to determine essential standards? That's only a piece of the puzzle in determining those standards. So it is our state accountability test. So we have to use it, but I will tell you, it is also used as your pacing guide. I know I need to teach these standards before March, before we're tested on them. and these essential standards and the rigor of that, and understand the rigor, but it is not the only thing that they're using to determine their essential standards. Those are conversations that happen within the school and the vertical alignment conversations that happen between grade levels. So it is just a piece of the puzzle and a different way of adding a little bit meat and depth to it. Someone said, can you please send me the PowerPoint? If you'll send me your email, I'll try to get those PowerPoints sent to you. And Jesse, I don't know if y'all can download a PDF or just one of your documents, a couple of your documents, and send those to me.
Yes,
So
I will be more than happy to.
And I'm going to bring up this point again, just because Sarah made that comment about the template is not where she falls or dies on the hill on. It's because it's the process. So remember, this is just a template, and if you need to change it up.
Well, and that's just like you saw, our 5th grade template is different than our 6th grade template. So we don't like, personally for us, when it's all in there, it's kind of overwhelming. So each essential standard has its own document for us, but 5th grade likes to keep it all in one place. So it's still the same concept, just what works best for your team.
Right. Absolutely. And it gives them, again, ownership in the process.
Mm-hmm.
The CTE collaborative teams, Cheryl, you just messed up. I have your information now, and I'm going to be calling you on that. So thank you so much for that. And then Sonia Wright McMurray is working on that as well. So, and they have also kicked up the playbooks. Someone asked a question about the playbooks and the difference in the playbooks. And those are on they're under P for playbooks on the ADE website. You will find units that are around essential standards that were determined by this collaborative state team. So someone asked, how did they determine essential standards when it's across the state? What they did is they met as a team. They said, okay, so according to my pacing guide, I didn't get to this essential standard. I didn't get to this essential standard. They came to a consensus on the essential standards that they did not address once we were released on, I think it started March 13th, but I think April 6th is when the governor said, we're not coming back for the rest of the year. So they took the standards that they had not taught at that time, and they created unit plans around those essential standards. It was not all of the essential standards. So if you're looking for essential standards for everything, they're not all addressed in those playbook units. So just know that there's just some that, and what the way they were intended was 2nd grade plan their unit plans, knowing that 3rd grade would be the one teaching them to address some of that unfinished learning. However, this year, 2nd grade may go pull some of those unit plans as they're teaching those standards again, because there's a lot of good resources in there. PowerPoint. Oh, good. Susan put the academic playbook link in the chat. So if y'all want to get to the playbook link, it's in there. And Susan, manages and does the Guide for Life. So Susan, if you don't mind, will you put your link in there to the Guide for Life plans, or if those up, I might just spilt something that that you had put out yet, but they've got some beautiful plans that are really helpful for you to use as a resource for the Guide for Life. Will we receive this recording? It will be uploaded. And how do you all address, oh, I missed it. I just lost that one. How do you all address this with the resource teachers, and how are they included and involved in the process? I'm so glad you asked that. So resource teachers, and I'm going to let Jesse talk about this too. Resource teachers are a very important part of the project because, or the process, because students need access to all grade level curriculum, because all we're doing is creating this big academic gap. If I have a 4th grade student who's reading on a 1st grade reading level, and I pull them during reading to teach them on a 1st grade reading level, well, how am I ever exposing them to the 4th grade level standards? I'm just creating, so then they get to 6th grade and now they're on 2nd grade reading. So how do we expose them? They may not can read on 4th grade level, but they can definitely hear on 4th grade and understand on 4th grade. So we may have to make those modifications, but the special ed resource teacher is so vital to the process. Jesse, will you speak just a minute on how y'all?
We are very fortunate that our resource teacher, specifically last year in particular, she sat in on the 6th grade literacy PLC meeting. So she was with us for that 2-hour uninterrupted protected block every single week. So she was there knowing what we were doing in our class and supplementing in her class. And we are also very fortunate. Sarah's calling me. We're also very fortunate that we have that win block, the what I need for 45 minutes. So if a student is in your classroom most of the time, they really try to pull during those times so they are not missing their grade level instruction. So we are very fortunate that they are still getting what they need in their resource classrooms, but they're still getting their instruction with us.
So when you have your tier 3, your tier 1 is happening in the classroom. If let's say I have a student who's a resource student and they're on tier 2 because they've been introduced to this grade level standard, if the special ed teacher knows what that essential standard is, on tier 2, they're working with them on that essential standard. Tier 3 is when they're working with them on their foundational skills.
Yes, ma'am.
So their phonics and their, or whatever they are, wherever they are, their grade level reading, wherever they are on that. Great suggestion on a librarian. I will throw that out. I'm creating a collaborative group of librarians. I think that would be awesome. We just started a collaborative group with higher ed and high school counselors on ACT data, finding trends with ACT data and trying to address those. So we will, and let me see what other questions. PowerPoint. Daily schedule. Would y'all get me your daily schedule? Will you send me a PDF of your daily schedule so I can share that?
We can.
We have Mike Mattis will be meeting on March 8th. He has a professional development on March 8th for secondary teachers or educators on creating a master schedule for secondary. And then on April, that's not at the top of my head. I can't remember. In April, he's doing elementary. So we will have 2 workshops with Mike Mattis, and those are free. And they are also found on the PLC events page where you can log into those. So we are always compared to a lot of teachers. Okay, the playbook is a great way to see how Arkansas. Oh, ELP, yes, English language proficiency standards are embedded in the playbook. So if you need to see how to do modifications, they did a super job of embedding those English language proficiency standards into each unit. And they took every unit that everybody did, and then they took them and aligned them to the ELP standards. So how does win time coordinate with pullouts, activities, PE, art, music, etc.?
It doesn't interfere. So, I mean, yes, I said they can pull. That's when they do try to pull for a lot of their resource classes if they can in their schedule, but they also have activity every single day. So we are just very fortunate that our schedule, they never get pulled out of an activity classroom.
Good deal.
Sarah and them just worked so hard on the schedule. It is just really, we are very fortunate.
Yeah, and you've got to create the time and structures if you want it to happen appropriately. So PowerPoint, the link didn't work, so I'll need to get that link to them. I think I've addressed, Jesse, do you see any other questions that I haven't addressed?
I was scrolling through them, and I do not think because I saw the win pull out. A lot of them are the emails and the recordings, so I have not seen anything that you missed.
Okay, so I will make sure that if you don't get the PowerPoint from me shortly, send me an email, and it's missy.wally@arkansas.gov, and you can send me an email there, and I will respond with the PowerPoint, and then I will have Jesse and them send me the PDFs, and I'll get those out to you as well. And then the recording will be up in a week. So I'll probably won't send the recording just because those are always large files. So they just download those to the website and you can pull those up. It's probably less than a week, but just in case, give me a little time. We will have another webinar coming up soon. I think it's the end of February. And I think it's on SMART goals. I'll have to look, but look for commissioner's memo on that one. Because we tried it. But the thing is, on these webinar recordings, even though you're joining us, you can go back and pull it wherever you are in the process and the journey of your, and get that information from previous webinars. Again, I thank y'all for joining us. We will stay on for just a moment and whatever questions you have. So if anybody wants to stay on and ask questions, I can stay around for a bit. I don't know if Jesse, you can join me for a little bit. And Sarah sent her apologies and she said, please, if you have any questions or if you want to do a visit to her school, y'all reach out to her because they've got a lot of great stuff going on there. But she said that she was sorry. It was her computer that was, it was plugged in, but it crashed. So I don't know what happened, but she's sorry that she missed out on that piece of it. So if you want to stay on and ask any questions, please do. The rest of you have a great day and stay safe and stay healthy.